The night my son locked me and my wife in the wine cellar was supposed to be a celebration. An anniversary banquet in the house I built my life around, surrounded by family, music drifting through old walls, candles still warm from dinner. Instead, I stood in cold stone air, watching my wife's breath shorten as the door sealed shut behind us. I knew, in that instant, that this was not a mistake. The footsteps moving away overhead, the music resuming, the lock newly replaced, this was confinement, deliberate and clean. My wife was fragile, her lungs already compromised, and the cellar did not forgive weakness. As I wrapped her in my jacket and steadied her breathing, something in me shifted. Betrayal has a sound when it clicks into place, and it is very quiet. Before I tell you how we survived that night, and how the balance of power in that house reversed without a single raised voice, I need to ask something of you. If you've ever been betrayed by your own blood, if you've ever endured quietly and waited for the right moment to act, please stay with me. Subscribe, and if this story stirs something familiar, share your own in the comments. Knowing I wasn't alone mattered more than I can explain. The sound of the lock was not loud. It was a precise sound, mechanical, final. I stood there for a moment longer than I should have, my hand still resting on the handle, feeling the truth settle into my bones. This was not a misunderstanding, not a drunken impulse or a poorly timed joke. The door had been closed from the outside, and the lock was new. I had noticed it earlier that evening, the brushed metal still too clean for an old estate, the screws unmarred. At the time, I had dismissed it as another of my son's quiet changes to a house he believed was already his. My wife's breathing pulled me back. The cellar air was colder than the rest of the lower level, heavy with dampness and the mineral smell of stone. It pressed itself into the lungs. I had brought her down here because my son had asked, framed it as a private moment, something sentimental after dinner. She trusted him. I did too, or at least I had learned to behave as if I did. She began to cry, softly at first, the sound caught between fear and the effort of drawing air. Her body had always been sensitive to cold, but since her illness, it was no longer a matter of discomfort. It was risk. I moved her away from the center of the room, guiding her toward a stack of wooden crates near the wine cases, the oldest ones with thicker wood and less moisture bleeding through. I helped her sit, keeping her upright, aligning her back the way the doctor had taught me, the way that allowed her lungs the most room to work. I took off my suit jacket and wrapped it around her shoulders, folding it tighter than I ever had in my life. The jacket still held some warmth from the banquet upstairs, from candlelight and bodies and the illusion of family. I pressed my forehead briefly against the top of her head, not to comfort her with words, I knew better than to waste her air, but to steady both of us. I tested the door again, slowly this time. No give. No internal latch. Whoever replaced the lock had made sure of that. I followed the edges of the frame with my fingers, searching for a release, a secondary mechanism, something left behind by an older builder who believed in redundancy. There was nothing. Only smooth wood, new metal, and intention. I scanned the cellar the way I once scanned job sites, my eyes adjusting to low light, my mind stripping the room down to structure and function. Stone walls, thick and load-bearing. Racks of bottles running the length of the space. Barrels stacked too high toward the back, older vintages kept for show more than use. Condensation clung to the glass, dripping slowly to the floor, each drop darkening the stone. There were vents, but they were high and narrow, set into the masonry for temperature regulation, not airflow for people. No service exit. No modern safety override. This cellar had been designed to preserve wine, not lives. Above us, footsteps moved. Chairs scraped. Glasses clinked. And then, unmistakably, music resumed. The same string arrangement that had been playing during dinner, turned up just enough to fill the space overhead. It was the confirmation I hadn't wanted but expected. The party was continuing. We had been removed from it, quietly and completely. I knelt in front of my wife and watched her breathing, counting it, keeping my own face calm. Panic is contagious, especially in close air. Her cries softened into shallow pulls, her chest rising too fast, too shallow. I adjusted her posture again, placed my hands where they needed to be, grounding her with pressure and presence rather than sound. As I did, a memory surfaced, not gently, but with the sharp clarity that comes when the mind is forced into survival. Decades earlier, before this estate belonged to my family, I had walked these lower levels with the previous owner. He had been an old man even then, proud of the house but practical about its flaws. He had spoken about the cellar in passing, about how it had been built in a different era, when estates planned for emergencies in ways modern architects considered excessive. He had shown me something then, almost as an afterthought, his hand brushing the stone as he spoke. At the time, it had meant nothing to me. Now, standing in the same cold air, with my wife struggling to breathe, the memory sharpened until it was no longer memory at all, but direction. I told myself to stay calm. To move slowly. To think. Whatever my son believed he had accomplished upstairs, whatever message he thought he had sent, it would not end here. Not in the dark. Not quietly. I positioned my wife more securely against the crates, checked her breathing one more time, and then stood. The cellar had not changed in its bones. Stone remembers what was built into it, even when people forget. And I knew exactly where to look. I did not rush to the back of the cellar. Rushing wastes air, and it wastes judgment. I stayed where I was for a few seconds longer, letting my eyes move naturally over the room so that if anyone ever asked later, I could honestly say nothing about my behavior had seemed unusual. Habit, built over decades, has a way of asserting itself even in moments like that. Especially in moments like that. My wife's breathing had found a fragile rhythm. Not good, but stable enough that I could move without fear of leaving her for a minute. I spoke to her quietly, not with words that required response, but with steady sound, the kind that anchors without demanding effort. I told her I was right there. I told her to keep her eyes on me. I told her to breathe with me. She nodded once, barely, trusting me the way she always had. Then I turned toward the barrels. The back section of the cellar was older than the rest, the stone darker, the mortar slightly uneven where repairs had been done by hand instead of machine. The newer racks were aligned cleanly, metal supports bolted into the floor with modern precision. The barrels, by contrast, rested on thick wooden cradles, their placement guided by weight and tradition rather than symmetry. That was where the previous owner had lingered all those years ago, his hand trailing along the wall as he spoke about the house surviving storms, power failures, even a fire once, long before my time. I walked slowly, counting my steps, feeling the temperature shift slightly as I moved away from the door. The air back there was marginally less disturbed, heavier still, but quieter. I slipped between two barrel racks and placed my palm against the stone. Stone tells the truth if you know how to listen to it. I ran my hand along the mortar lines, not pressing yet, just feeling. Most of the wall was rough, the texture uneven, biting slightly into the skin. Then I found it, a section smoother than the rest, no wider than my shoulders, its edges masked by shadow and age. The mortar here was tighter, more deliberate. The stone itself sat a fraction deeper than its neighbors, a difference no one would notice unless they were looking for it. I closed my eyes briefly, letting the memory finish unfolding. The old man had smiled when he showed me, the kind of smile people wear when they know something others don't think to ask about. He had said it was built for emergencies. For times when being trapped was not theoretical. I pressed along the right edge, carefully, applying pressure the way he had demonstrated, firm but patient. Nothing happened at first. I adjusted my hand, moved lower, then higher. There it was, a subtle give, almost imperceptible, followed by the softest click, swallowed by the thick air of the cellar. I exhaled for the first time since the door had closed. The stone panel did not swing open. It slid, moving inward and to the side on a concealed track, stone grinding softly against stone. Behind it was a narrow cavity built into the wall itself, sealed from moisture, darker than the cellar but intact. The smell inside was different, cleaner, untouched by wine or dampness. I reached in and felt cold metal beneath my fingers. The lockbox was exactly where the memory said it would be. Rectangular, heavy, its surface dulled but unmarred, sealed against time. I lifted it out with both hands, careful not to scrape it against the stone, and set the panel back in place temporarily. Not closed, just resting. I wasn't finished yet, and I didn't want to fumble later. I carried the box toward the tasting table beneath the single dim light that hung over that end of the cellar. As I set it down, I felt the weight of more than metal in my hands. This was not just storage. It was foresight. It was contingency. It was proof that the house had never truly belonged to anyone who thought ownership was simply a matter of locks and doors. Before opening it, I looked back at my wife. She was watching me now, her eyes clearer, fixed on my face. I gave her a small nod, not reassurance, not promise, just acknowledgement. She didn't need explanations. She needed stability, and I could give her that. I opened the lockbox. Inside, wrapped carefully in oilcloth, were papers I recognized before I fully understood them. Deeds. Trust documents. Notarized statements bearing names and dates that predated my son's confidence by decades. There was also a small digital storage device, sealed separately, preserved like everything else in that cavity. I did not read everything then. I didn't need to. I had spent my life around contracts and contingencies. I knew the look of authority when I saw it. And I knew, with absolute clarity, that the events unfolding upstairs had just triggered something no one else in that house even knew existed. I repacked the contents slowly, deliberately, the way you handle something that will soon change the shape of many lives. Then I returned the box to the cavity, slid the stone panel back into place, and ran my hand over the mortar one last time until it disappeared into the wall again. By the time I knelt back down beside my wife, the cellar felt different. Still cold. Still dangerous. But no longer powerless. We were still confined. After the panel slid back into place, I did not let myself linger on what I had found. Knowledge can be as dangerous as ignorance if you hold it at the wrong moment. What mattered then was time, and how carefully I used it. I returned to my wife and lowered myself beside her, keeping my body between hers and the cold stone as much as I could. The jacket was already losing warmth, the fabric damp at the edges where condensation clung to everything in that room. I adjusted it anyway, tucking it tighter around her shoulders, rubbing slow circles against her upper back to keep the muscles from tightening. Her breathing was still shallow, but it had slowed enough that I could stop counting every rise and fall. Above us, the banquet carried on. I could hear laughter now, the kind that swells after wine has had time to soften people. Silverware scraped against plates. Someone clapped. It was all perfectly ordinary, and that was the part that stayed with me, the normalcy of it. The ease with which people can step over cruelty when it is hidden behind closed doors. I thought of my son then. Not with anger, not yet. Anger clouds judgment, and I needed mine clear. I thought instead of how deliberate this had been. He had asked me to escort my wife downstairs himself. He had waited until we were alone. He had made sure the lock was new, the door solid, the timing precise. This was not a moment of temper. It was a lesson he thought he was teaching. I rested my hand over my wife's and felt how cold her fingers had become. That sharpened my focus more than anything else could have. Whatever authority he believed he was asserting upstairs, he had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. Endangerment is not symbolic. It is not theoretical. It leaves marks, even when it does not leave bruises. I kept my face calm when footsteps finally returned overhead. They moved back and forth near the cellar door, hesitant now, the way people hesitate when they know they have gone too far but are not ready to admit it. I heard voices lower, muffled by the floorboards. Then keys. A pause. The door opened. Light spilled down the stairs, warmer than the cellar air, carrying music and the smell of food with it. My son stood there, his expression composed, almost bored. He did not ask if we were all right. He did not apologize. He simply watched, as if assessing whether his point had landed. I stood slowly, keeping one arm steady around my wife as I helped her to her feet. I let my movements look heavy, tired. I allowed my shoulders to slump just enough to signal defeat. Power, I have learned, often reveals itself in what you choose not to show. He spoke then, not loudly, not harshly, framing the confinement as discipline, as boundaries, as his right within his house. I did not respond. I nodded once, the way a man nods when he has heard something he does not intend to argue with in that moment. Upstairs, guests barely noticed our return. The music swelled again. Someone pressed a glass into my hand. I declined it gently. My wife was guided to a chair, fussed over briefly, then forgotten. The evening resumed as if nothing unusual had occurred. That was when I knew my patience would be rewarded. In the kitchen later, away from the guests, my son and his wife outlined new expectations. New rules. New authority within the estate. They spoke as if ownership were already settled, as if compliance were assumed. I offered minimal resistance. I asked no questions. I let them believe the cellar had achieved its purpose. That night, after the house finally quieted and my wife slept fitfully beside me, I made a single call. Not to family. Not to friends. To the legal office named in the documents I had seen only briefly under cellar light. I reported the confinement calmly, factually. A medically vulnerable resident. A locked cellar. No internal release. No consent. The silence on the other end of the line was long, but it was not uncertainty. It was recognition. Everything after that moved the way well-built systems always do, slowly at first, then all at once. And for the first time since the cellar door closed, I slept without listening for footsteps. Morning came slowly in that house, the way it always had. Light crept through tall windows, filtered by old trees planted by men who believed in patience. The estate had a habit of pretending nothing had changed, even when everything had. That morning was no different. My wife slept longer than usual. Her breathing was steadier now, but the night had taken something from her: strength, warmth, confidence in a place she once called safe. I stayed awake beside her, listening, counting again, not out of fear this time but out of habit. When you spend enough years protecting something fragile, vigilance becomes second nature. Downstairs, the house stirred. Cabinets opened. Coffee brewed. Voices carried with forced normalcy. No one mentioned the cellar. No one apologized. Silence, I knew, was not ignorance. It was strategy. At breakfast, my son behaved as though he had proven something the night before. His posture was different, more upright, more settled. He spoke about schedules, about changes he intended to make to the estate, about how things would be run, going forward. His wife echoed him, her tone measured, almost rehearsed. They spoke to me as one might speak to an aging employee who had not yet realized he was being phased out. I listened. I nodded when expected. I asked after nothing. This was not submission. This was reconnaissance. Every word they used mattered. Every assumption they revealed mattered more. They spoke freely because they believed the lesson had been effective. Because they believed fear had replaced authority. Men make their worst mistakes when they think the fight is over. Later that morning, after my wife was settled near the window with a blanket and tea, I stepped into the study and closed the door. The room still smelled faintly of old paper and polished wood. My father's desk sat exactly where it always had, the grain worn smooth by decades of use. I sat there and placed my phone on the surface, waiting. The call came sooner than I expected. The voice on the other end was calm, professional, and already informed. The report I had made the night before had not been treated as a family dispute. It had been logged as an incident. The language mattered. Confinement. Endangerment. Breach of residency conditions. Each term carried weight far heavier than my son understood. I was asked to confirm details. I did. I was asked about documentation. I said it existed. I was not asked where it was kept. When the call ended, I sat in silence for a long time, looking around a room filled with things my son believed he would inherit by default. He did not understand that estates, like people, respond to stress by revealing their true structure. And the structure of this one had been designed long before he imagined himself at its center. Over the next 2 days, nothing outwardly changed. That was the most telling part. My son grew more confident, not less. He spoke of renovations. Of new security. Of redefining roles within the household. He suggested, casually, that perhaps my wife and I might be more comfortable relocating to a smaller place, something easier to manage. I agreed that comfort was important. I did not agree to anything else. On the third morning, 2 cars pulled into the drive just after 10. Not unmarked. Not aggressive. Official, but restrained. People who understood that authority does not need to announce itself loudly. My son came to find me, irritation already in his voice, asking if I had invited anyone. I told him no. I told him perhaps the house itself had. When the representatives entered, documents in hand, the tone of the room shifted immediately. They did not argue. They did not accuse. They explained. Calmly. Thoroughly. With signatures and seals that did not require my presence to carry weight. The breach had been confirmed. The conditions had been met. Authority reverted, automatically and irrevocably, triggered not by emotion but by action. My son's face changed then, not with rage, but with disbelief. The kind that comes when a man realizes he never knew where the ground beneath him truly was. I stood beside my wife as the words settled into the walls. She held my hand, her grip still weak but steady. The cellar door remained downstairs, unchanged. But the house no longer answered to him. Authority does not shout when it knows it will be obeyed. It speaks plainly and lets the room adjust itself. The representatives introduced themselves by name and affiliation, not to me, but to the house. That was how it felt. Their documents rested on the dining table where the night before crystal glasses had stood, and the contrast was not lost on anyone. Paper carries a different kind of weight when it has been prepared long in advance. My son tried to speak early, his voice sharpened by confusion more than anger. He asked who had authorized this, why they were here, what right anyone had to step into what he believed was his domain. The answers came calmly, each one dismantling his assumptions without ever addressing his tone. They explained the trust the way one explains gravity, present whether acknowledged or not. Layered ownership. Conditional residency. Protective clauses written decades ago by someone who had understood that family, when combined with property, requires safeguards stronger than sentiment. The documents were old, but the language was precise. Endangerment of a registered resident. Unlawful confinement. Breach of care provisions. Each term clicked into place with clinical inevitability. I watched my son's wife then. She said nothing. Her eyes moved quickly, scanning faces, papers, exits. She understood faster than he did. Some people recognize shifting ground the moment it begins to move. When they asked me to confirm the incident, I did so without embellishment. I described the cellar. The lock. The absence of an internal release. My wife's medical condition. I did not raise my voice. I did not accuse. I simply told the truth the way it had happened. The kind of truth that does not require performance. They nodded. Notes were made. The decision had already been reached. This meeting was not for debate. It was for notice. My son was informed that his right to reside on the estate had been revoked, effective immediately. That he and his wife would be given a fixed window to collect personal belongings under supervision. That any attempt to interfere with the process would result in escalation. The words were neutral. The outcome was not. For the first time since the cellar, he looked at me directly, not as a father, not as an obstacle, but as someone he no longer understood. There was something almost childlike in that look, the confusion of realizing the rules had never been the ones he thought he was breaking. He asked me why I hadn't warned him. I considered that question carefully before answering. Then I said nothing. Silence, I had learned, is sometimes the most accurate response. The house seemed to breathe as they moved through it, marking rooms, noting conditions, documenting occupancy. My wife sat quietly beside me, wrapped in a shawl, her color slowly returning. She did not speak, but her hand never left mine. By late afternoon, my son and his wife were packing. Not dramatically. Not angrily. With the stiff, contained movements of people who know protest will only make things worse. Boxes were carried out. Doors closed. Keys surrendered. When the cars finally left the drive, the estate settled into a stillness I had not felt in years. Not emptiness. Relief. That evening, I walked down to the cellar alone. I stood at the door for a long moment before opening it, listening to the quiet on the other side. Then I turned the handle and stepped inside. The air was still cold. The stone unchanged. But the lock, still new, still gleaming, no longer held any authority over me. Some structures are meant to preserve things. Others exist to remind you who they were built for. I turned off the light and closed the door behind me, not out of fear, but choice. The days that followed were quieter than I expected. Not empty, just stripped of pretense. When people leave a place under supervision, they take what they can carry, not what they once imagined owning. What remained in the house after my son was gone told a more honest story than anything he had ever said aloud. My wife moved slowly at first, relearning the rooms as if they had subtly rearranged themselves while she slept. Trauma does that. It turns familiar spaces into questions. I stayed close without hovering, letting her set the pace. Control, I had learned, is something you return to people gently, not all at once. The representatives returned once more to finalize the transition. There were forms to sign, seals to witness, procedures to close. It was all done with the same restraint as before. No congratulations. No commentary. Just completion. When they left, the estate was once again what it had always claimed to be, a place governed by foresight rather than impulse. That evening, I sat alone in the study and opened the lockbox again, this time under proper light. I read everything carefully. The trust had been designed with a clarity I admired. It did not punish ambition. It punished negligence. It did not protect sentiment. It protected people. The clauses my son had triggered were not hidden traps, they were safeguards, activated only when someone confused authority with cruelty. I thought about how close we had come to something irreversible. How easily a locked door and cold air could have rewritten my life. The realization did not make me bitter. It made me precise. My wife joined me later, sitting across from me at the desk. She did not ask questions about the documents. She did not need to. Instead, she asked if we were safe now. I told her yes. And for the first time since the banquet, I meant it without qualification. Outside, the estate settled into night. Lights dimmed. Old trees moved slightly in the wind. Somewhere deep within the walls, stone and timber held their positions, unchanged by the drama that had briefly played out within them. Houses, like people, remember what they survive. I closed the lockbox and returned it to the wall the next morning. Not because I needed to hide it again, but because some things are meant to stay where they were designed to be. Quiet. Ready. Waiting. When I slid the panel shut and smoothed my hand over the mortar, I understood something clearly: justice does not always arrive loudly, and it does not always look like triumph. Sometimes it looks like the absence of fear. Sometimes it looks like breathing easily in a room that once tried to take that away. The cellar remained downstairs, unchanged. But it no longer held any power over us. In the weeks that followed, the estate returned to its older rhythms. Not the artificial schedule my son had imposed, but the slower cadence that had existed before he began measuring worth in leverage. Mornings came without tension. Doors opened without pause. Silence no longer felt like something waiting to break. I found that silence has weight when it is earned. My wife's recovery was gradual, but it was real. The cough that had lingered after the cellar faded. Her sleep deepened. She began to move through the house without watching doorframes the way she had in the days immediately after. Trauma loosens its grip slowly, and only when it believes it is no longer needed. We spoke about that night only once. It happened over tea in the late afternoon, sunlight settling across the floor in long rectangles. She asked me if I had known what would happen when I escorted her downstairs. The question was not an accusation. It was curiosity, quiet and careful. I told her the truth. I said I had trusted our son until the door closed. That I had not anticipated the lock, only the request. She nodded, absorbing that without judgment. Then she said something I did not expect. She said the worst part had not been the cold or the fear. It had been the certainty, in that moment, that we had been deliberately removed. That someone we loved had decided we were expendable. I understood that. Structures fail when people do, not the other way around. After that conversation, we did not return to the subject. Some experiences do not need to be revisited to remain understood. They simply settle into the foundation of who you are afterward. Occasionally, letters arrived. Not apologies. Explanations. My son wrote twice, his words circling responsibility without ever touching it. He spoke of misunderstandings, of stress, of intentions that had been misread. I read the first letter fully. The second, I did not finish. I placed them both in a drawer and closed it. There was nothing left to clarify. The estate required attention again, not repairs, but care. I walked the grounds with a notebook, marking things that had been neglected during the months of tension. A fence that needed reinforcing. A tree whose roots were beginning to test the stone path. Ordinary maintenance, the kind that keeps places honest. One afternoon, I returned to the cellar with my wife. Not to prove anything. Not to confront it. Just to reclaim it. We stood together at the bottom of the stairs. I let her decide how far to go. She stepped inside, felt the air, then nodded once. We did not stay long. We did not need to. The space no longer belonged to that night. As we left, she reached out and took my hand. "Thank you," she said quietly. She did not specify for what. She did not need to. Some power is never spoken aloud. It is simply exercised, once, correctly, and then set aside. The cellar door closed behind us, unlocked. And for the first time since the banquet, the house felt complete again. Time does something subtle after events like that. It does not rush to heal. It reorganizes. I began to notice how my days changed in small, almost forgettable ways. I no longer paused before entering rooms. I no longer listened for footsteps that did not belong to us. Even my posture shifted, shoulders settling, breath deepening, as if my body had finally received permission to stand fully inside its own life again. My wife started tending the small greenhouse at the edge of the property, the one she had abandoned months earlier when the house stopped feeling like hers. At first, she worked in silence, hands in soil, methodical and calm. Then, slowly, she began to hum again. Not loudly. Just enough that I noticed from the path nearby. That sound stayed with me. The estate itself responded to care the way it always had. Things repaired cleanly. Systems worked as intended. When places are treated with respect, they do not resist. They cooperate. I spent an afternoon reviewing the trust with the legal office, not because I needed to assert control, but because I wanted clarity. Control exercised without understanding becomes something else entirely. They walked me through every clause again, every contingency, every safeguard that had once felt abstract and now felt painfully specific. What struck me most was how little of it was reactive. The trust did not punish my son. It simply withdrew permission. It did not seek retribution. It restored balance. The design was not emotional. It was ethical. That mattered. One evening, weeks later, I received a call I had expected but not anticipated. My son's voice was flatter than before, stripped of the certainty he once wore so easily. He asked if we could talk. Not about the house. About everything. I listened. I said nothing until he finished. Then I told him, calmly, that I wished him no harm. That I hoped he would build a life that did not require testing the limits of others. And that until he understood what he had done, not just legally, but humanly, there was nothing more for us to discuss. He did not argue. That, more than anything, told me how far the ground beneath him had shifted. After the call, I stood at the window for a long time, watching the last light fade behind the trees. There was no satisfaction in that moment. No victory. Only a quiet certainty that the line had been drawn in the right place. Later that night, I walked the perimeter of the house one last time before bed, a habit I had not realized I had resumed. Doors secure. Lights low. Everything in its place. When I returned inside, my wife was already asleep, her breathing even, untroubled. I lay beside her and let the stillness settle. The cellar existed below us, unchanged. But it had become just another room again. And that, I understood, was the real restoration. Power leaves traces when it departs. Not damage, necessarily, more like impressions, the way heavy furniture leaves its outline in a carpet long after it's been moved. I noticed those outlines in the weeks that followed, subtle marks of how the house had been used against itself. Some rooms felt lighter than others. The guest wing, once filled with plans and claims, returned easily to neutrality. The main hall took longer. That was where authority had been performed most often, where voices had carried with intention. Sound lingers in places like that. It has to be allowed to fade. I resisted the urge to change things too quickly. No renovations. No declarations. Restoration is not about erasure, it's about re-establishing function. I let the house be what it was, trusting that time and use would do the rest. My wife surprised me one morning by suggesting we host a small dinner. Just a few people. No ceremony. No speeches. The idea unsettled me at first, not because I feared a repeat, but because I realized how deeply the previous night had conditioned my instincts. I agreed anyway. Healing, I've learned, sometimes requires stepping back into spaces carefully rather than avoiding them altogether. The dinner was uneventful in the best possible way. Food was simple. Conversation ordinary. Laughter unforced. When the evening ended, no one lingered for leverage. They left with coats in hand and gratitude expressed plainly. Afterward, my wife stood in the doorway of the dining room and looked around as if seeing it clearly for the first time in months. She said it felt like ours again. That mattered more than anything written in a trust. I returned to the cellar one final time not long after, alone, carrying nothing but a small flashlight. I wanted to make sure nothing remained unresolved there, not structurally, but psychologically. I checked the lock. I checked the hinges. I confirmed what I already knew, the danger had never been the room itself. It had been the intention applied to it. I turned off the light and stood in the dark for a moment, breathing easily. Cold air no longer felt threatening when choice returned to it. When I went back upstairs, I did not look over my shoulder. Some lessons are loud. Others do their work quietly and never announce themselves again. This one had done its work. What remained was not triumph, not regret, but something steadier. Continuity. The kind that lets a man grow older without shrinking. The kind that lets a house stand without fear of what happens behind closed doors. There is a moment after everything settles when you realize you are no longer bracing for impact. It comes quietly. You wake one morning and notice your jaw isn't clenched. Your first breath isn't shallow. Your thoughts no longer start with contingency. That was when I knew the worst of it was over. I began taking my walks again along the far boundary of the property, the path that curves behind the old trees and disappears briefly from view of the house. I had stopped using it during the months when the estate felt less like a refuge and more like contested ground. Walking it now felt like reclaiming a part of myself I had set aside without realizing it. My wife joined me when she could. Not always for the full length, but enough. Her strength was returning in increments, measured, deliberate. We did not talk much on those walks. We didn't need to. Shared silence had become something safe again. Every so often, a memory of the cellar surfaced without warning. Not as fear, but as awareness. I found myself noticing small things more sharply, the temperature of a room, the sound a door makes when it closes, the way people pause before answering questions they don't want to hear. Experience, once earned, does not fade. It refines. I also found that my understanding of my son had shifted. I no longer tried to explain his actions away or fit them into some narrative that preserved the illusion of inevitability. He had made choices. Clear ones. The consequences were not punishment, they were alignment. Actions meeting structure. Intention meeting design. That clarity brought an unexpected peace. One afternoon, I received confirmation that the trust review was complete. All conditions restored. All safeguards reaffirmed. The estate was, in every sense that mattered, secure. The language was formal, but the meaning was simple. Nothing like that could happen again. Not here. Not to us. I shared the news with my wife over dinner. She smiled, then reached across the table and rested her hand over mine. The gesture was small, but it carried the weight of everything we had endured together. No words followed. None were required. That night, as I turned off the lights, I paused at the top of the cellar stairs. Not out of habit. Out of choice. I stood there for a moment, listening to the house settle, feeling its age and endurance beneath my feet. Then I turned away. Some doors are meant to be remembered. Others are meant to be left alone. There are things that do not return after an event like that. Not because they are taken, but because they are no longer needed. I noticed this gradually, the way you notice a scar only when you go looking for it. I stopped rehearsing conversations in my head. Stopped preparing explanations no one had asked for. Stopped wondering how a room might turn against us if the wrong person stood in the wrong place. That vigilance had served its purpose. Now it was excess weight. My wife began rearranging photographs in the hallway without mentioning it first. She moved some closer together, spaced others apart, removed a few entirely. I watched her do it one afternoon, her movements careful but assured. It wasn't about aesthetics. It was about curation, deciding what deserved to remain visible. I didn't question her choices. One frame, empty now, sat on the console for a few days before she put it away. She never said which memory it had held. She didn't need to. Some absences explain themselves. We received fewer messages as time went on. Silence, once strategic, became final. I did not chase it. I did not try to repair what had been broken by intention rather than accident. Repair requires willingness on both sides. Without that, it becomes self-erasure. The estate itself seemed to settle deeper into its foundations. Old houses do that when tension leaves them. Floors creaked less. Doors closed more softly. Or perhaps I was simply no longer listening for signs of threat. It's hard to tell where perception ends and reality begins after something like that. One evening, my wife asked if I regretted how things had ended. I thought about it carefully before answering. Regret is not the same as grief. Regret assumes an alternative you wish you had chosen. I did not wish for a different response. I wished for a different choice to have been made by someone else, but that was never mine to control. I told her no. She nodded, accepting that without challenge, and changed the subject to something ordinary. That, more than the question itself, told me we were moving forward. Later that night, I stood by the window again, watching the grounds in moonlight. The cellar lay below, silent and inert, its role finished. It had been a test, not a destination. I realized then that the house had not protected us. We had protected each other. The house had simply remembered how. Endurance is quieter than survival. Survival announces itself with relief, with shaking hands finally allowed to rest. Endurance is what follows, the steady continuation once the noise has passed. I saw it in my wife first. She began making plans again, not grand ones, not distant ones, but small forward-looking gestures. A visit with an old friend. A seasonal planting schedule for the greenhouse. The replacement of a chair whose loose leg she had tolerated for years without complaint. These were not distractions. They were declarations. Life, resumed on her terms. I mirrored that without thinking about it. I returned to projects I had postponed, not because they were difficult, but because they required mental space I hadn't been willing to give. I repaired a gate at the far edge of the property, taking my time, aligning each hinge carefully. I reorganized the study, not to erase the past, but to reassert order. Each task reminded me that stability is not passive. It is built and maintained. The cellar faded from my thoughts, though not from my awareness. Some knowledge remains without demanding attention. It stays available, like a tool you hope never to use again but will not discard. Occasionally, I wondered what my son told himself about what happened. Whether he framed it as betrayal, misfortune, or injustice. People choose their narratives the way they choose their defenses. I did not try to correct his. Understanding is not something you can impose from the outside. What mattered was what endured here. Trust, carefully restored. Safety, re-established without spectacle. A sense of place no longer contested. One afternoon, while sorting old records, I found notes I had taken years ago during that long-ago walkthrough with the previous owner. Small sketches. Measurements. A brief mention of the cellar feature, written without emphasis. At the time, it had been trivia. Now it felt like a quiet inheritance, knowledge passed forward without ceremony, waiting for the moment it would be needed. I closed the notebook and returned it to the shelf. That night, as the house settled into sleep, I realized something else had changed. The future no longer felt like something I had to guard against. It felt open again. Unthreatening. Earned. Endurance, I understood, is not about standing firm forever. It's about knowing when firmness is no longer required. There comes a point when everything that needed to be proven already has been. After that, continuing to explain only weakens the truth. I reached that point quietly. The final correspondence arrived in late autumn, delivered by registered mail, its envelope heavy with formality. My son had retained counsel. Not to contest the trust, there was nothing left to contest, but to request clarification, consideration, and reconciliation. The words were arranged carefully, respectful on the surface, hollow underneath. I read it once, folded it back into its envelope, and placed it where it would not demand further attention. Some accounts do not close with conversation. They close with understanding. I responded through the same legal office that had restored the estate. The reply was brief. Polite. Final. There would be no further discussion until certain acknowledgments were made, acknowledgments not of loss, but of harm. Until then, distance would remain. Distance, I had learned, is not cruelty. It is containment. The estate entered winter with a kind of dignity I had not noticed before. The grounds were quieter, the air sharper, the nights longer. My wife took to sitting by the window with a blanket and a book, the light low, the room warm. I watched her breathe easily, and each time it felt like a private victory no one else needed to see. We prepared for the season without ceremony. No large gatherings. No performances of unity. Just us, and the house, and the calm that comes when nothing is being tested. One evening, while checking the lower levels before bed, I paused again near the cellar. I did not go down. I did not need to. Its presence was no longer symbolic. It was simply part of the structure, known, accounted for, neutral. That was the last time I thought of it in any meaningful way. When you live long enough, you learn that justice does not always announce itself with punishment. Sometimes it arrives as permanence, the quiet certainty that what was done cannot be undone, but neither can it be repeated. The accounts were closed. All that remained was to live. The last thing to return was not joy. It was trust in the ordinary. It came one morning without ceremony, as most meaningful things do. I woke before dawn, the house still dark, and realized I was no longer listening for anything. No distant movement. No imagined threat. Just the quiet presence of a place doing what it was built to do, shelter, not test. I made coffee and stood at the kitchen window as the first light crept across the grounds. Frost clung to the grass, thin and delicate, melting slowly as the sun rose. I watched it disappear without resistance. That felt right. My wife joined me a little later, wrapped in a sweater, her step steady. She leaned against the counter and looked out with me, and for a long moment neither of us spoke. Then she said something simple, almost casual. "It feels finished now." I understood exactly what she meant. Not forgotten. Not erased. Finished. The cellar remained where it had always been, below us, part of the structure but no longer part of the story. The lockbox stayed sealed, not out of secrecy, but respect. Some safeguards exist so you don't have to think about them again. We moved forward without announcements. Days filled themselves with small certainties, meals taken slowly, evenings unhurried, plans made without needing contingency. The estate was no longer a symbol of control or inheritance or leverage. It was just our home. From time to time, I thought of my son. Not with anger. Not even with disappointment. With distance. The kind that allows clarity without reopening wounds. Whatever path he chose next would be his alone. I had done what was required of me, and nothing more. There is a dignity in stopping at the right moment. What mattered was this: when faced with betrayal, I did not retaliate. I endured. I observed. I acted when action mattered, and I stopped when stopping preserved peace. Justice did not arrive through confrontation. It arrived through structure doing exactly what it was designed to do. My wife's breathing was easy again. The house was quiet. The future felt unthreatening. That was the restoration. Not victory. Not revenge. Just the return of a life that could continue without fear, steady, lawful, and whole.